What is the scariest story you know that is 100% true? My friend's boss bought an Audi A4 convertible, back when they were new and interesting. One of the talking points was the pop-up roll hoops that were hidden unless you rolled it. A few months after buying it he got to test those roll hoops out, as he lost control and skidded down a steep bank about 10 meters, approximately 35 feet deep. The roll hoops did their job, and he survived with just cuts and scratches from the bushes he'd plowed through. The car ended up the right way up and he got out, walked back up the bank to the side of the road, then got on the phone to the police to report the accident. While he was standing there, a driver from a car that had seen the accident came over to speak to him. Approaching from behind, the other driver asked if he was okay. My friend's boss turned around to reply and dropped dead. His neck had been fractured, but was in one piece right up until he turned his head, when it severed his spinal cord. Various torture murders are probably the most horrific things I've read about. Junko Furuta, who was a perfectly normal girl until she was kidnapped off the street by a gang for no reason, purely wrong place, wrong time, according to Japanese sources, and unimaginably raped and tortured to death over 44 days. Kiki Camarena, a D agent in Mexico who was kidnapped by the Guadalajara cartel and tortured to death over about 3 days. His story is the central focus of the show Narcos, Mexico, but from what I've read, his death was even more brutal than what they make it out to be. A detail consistent in both is that they brought in a doctor to revive him numerous times when he got too close to death, and keep him conscious so he couldn't pass out from the pain. Kelly Ann Bates, who was groomed from a young age by a scumbag who eventually killed her slowly over the course of about a month in their apartment. Her injuries were so horrific the jury at the guy's trial had to get counseling. For example, her eyes were missing and there were stab wounds in the sockets. Sylvia Likens, whose parents left her in the care of a woman who both personally and with the help of her children and their friends degraded, tortured, and killed over several months. The Hello Kitty murder in China, where a man and his about 13-year-old girlfriend kidnapped a prostitute who had supposedly stolen from him, even though sources say she had paid him back with interest, tortured her to death, and then stuffed her corpse into a Hello Kitty toy. Baby Brianna, a newborn whose mother, father, and uncle tortured and raped her from the second they brought her home from the hospital until the second she died. Baby P, a British toddler whose mother let her boyfriend torture him to death. His back was broken in his last days of life. Honestly, there are just so many horrifically on par with each other, you could list them all day. I've posted this before, but mine, when I was a baby, my dad played on a softball team. Typical social team, out for beers and pizza after with the guys, family event type thing. My parents were good friends with two of the other couples, both of them had young kids as well. On this occasion, the other two couples had left their kids at one of their houses, with a babysitter they were splitting. They invited my parents back to the house to have some more beers that night, but I was being fussy and my mom nixed the idea, though they would 100% have normally gone back to hang out. Well, it turned out my fussiness on that day saved our lives. When the other parents got back to the house, they walked in on a home invasion. Two men had broken in, tied up the kids and the babysitter and her boyfriend, and were waiting for the parents. Took the parents hostage as well, and made the dads drive with them to Banks, a grocery store where one dad was manager, and clear out accounts, a safe. They then came back to the house, and slaughtered both families, the babysitter, and her boyfriend. Kids included. They caught the two guys later on. My dad attended the trials, and said it was the first time he had ever had thoughts of supporting the death penalty. It still gives me chills to know how close we came to getting killed that day, too. Edit, wow, you guys are amazing detectives. I have been telling this story for years, and this is the first time I have been made aware that it wasn't me as a baby, it was my sister, 9 years older, born in '72. My dad has been telling me this story wrong for as long as I can remember. Sorry for the confusion, all. Told this here before, but once more, my friend had this neighbor who was a retired mechanic. They lived on some properties with large front lawns and long driveways. His neighbor had a couple derelict cars parked up near his garage that he took parts from occasionally. This neighbor of his started hearing noises while sitting in his living room, coming from his front yard. Every time he'd go to the window, there would be nothing there. He assumed it was a raccoon or a coyote or whatever. He kept hearing the noise, so he'd go outside to look around but would find nothing. He'd put out traps and occasionally catch something, yet the noise persisted. Soon, he started claiming that he was hearing voices coming from the front yard, like whispering. He'd go outside and look around the perimeter of his property but would find nothing. It was persistent, so he'd started calling the cops. Every time the cops came and looked around and would find nothing. So they told him he needed to stop calling them for this, and perhaps get a security camera or whatever. So this guy thought he was losing his mind. One summer evening he couldn't sleep, so he went to the back patio to smoke a cigarette. Suddenly, he heard voices coming from the front of his house. He put his cig out and snuck around to the front and got there just in time to see the doors to his derelict conversion van silently shut. He ran back to the backyard and went inside his home and called the police to tell them what he had seen. The police arrived and approached cold, i.e. without lights, sirens, and when they approached the van, the doors swung open and a bunch of people ran out in every direction. Upon searching the van, the cops found syringes and paraphernalia and determined that people were shooting up in there. My dad and some friends got drunk and went for a drive on some back roads and were going as fast as the truck would go as teenagers. My dad was slightly less drunk than the others and eventually demanded they let him get out. They pulled over and he and one other girl got out. He and the girl started walking to town while the other three sped off in the opposite direction. Well, less than a mile up the road from where they got out is an extremely sharp turn, which they missed and hit a tree going pretty close to triple digits miles per hour. Two of them died on impact, and the only reason the third survived is because they crashed in front of a house that two doctors lived in. The survivor was paralyzed and lost his leg and part of his arm and was in the hospital for 8 months before dying. This was in the 60s, so medical care wasn't what it is today. When I first got my permit, my dad took me to that corner to explain the importance of safe driving. It gave me goosebumps about how close he was to being in the truck. He said that the dad of the driver got what remained of the truck to be hung up in the center of town for months after, to be a warning to all. It's the spring of 2001. I was just ending my shift at a major hospital in New York. I headed back to my apartment, entertained my daughter with random conversation for a while, had a meal, and was chilling out. Business as usual. Later that night, my mother came by and took me back to the very same hospital where I worked. We were conversing in the car, and nothing seemed out of sorts at all. She never mentioned where we were headed, and I had no idea of the destination until we actually arrived. When we arrived at the hospital, I kept getting questioned about who I was, including who I really was, where I grew up, who my daughter was, where I lived, and more. Battery after battery of third degree, coming out of absolutely nowhere. I had no clue what was going on or why anyone was interrogating me this way. Fast forward to about 3 days later or so. I find myself sitting in a chair, calmly looking out at a lovely view from my apartment window. Except this wasn't my apartment. In a quiet panic, I took stock of my surroundings and realized I was at the end of a hallway, and I'd been here before. It was the hospital where I worked, but it wasn't in New York. It was Portland, and it was the psych floor. In an instant, I had no idea why I was there, what day or time it was, nor what had gone on since my last shift on the floors beneath. It turns out that I was, indeed, working a regular shift several days prior. The story is that I walked off the job with no warning nor explanation, went to my mother's place, and was rambling on about what I needed to do in the city the next day. She took me to the where I reported living in NYC, complete with some bogus address and phone number. With my daughter, I was claiming that my little sister was my daughter. They admitted me, and I didn't break back into generally accepted reality for several days. When I came to, as described above, I had absolutely no idea what had happened, why I was locked up again, nor any memory whatsoever of what I'd said or done after that instant walking off of my shift. Statistically, probably no one reading this has been blessed with the misfortune of dissociative fugue. Sitting in that chair by the window at the end of a hospital hallway, when literally 1 instant earlier I'd been casually going about my job, felt just as disorienting and jarring as you'd imagine. I know this isn't a serial killer or drunk driver story, but it's absolutely true, and it's the single most terrifying event of my life. I wouldn't wish that instant reality shift sensation on my very worst enemy. Psychosis is a hell of a drug. Edit silver and gold. You guys. I might be the world's worst at accepting compliments, but I thank every one of you for your kindness, your understanding, and for sharing your own stories. After a long and inwardly violent road through psychotic hell, I'm finding comfort in this outpouring and the sense that I may not be as isolated as I've long thought. Thank you all for that.